Could this just be a tactic for negotiating a temporary ceasefire agreement, making it be more in Israel's favor? Or do you see this as a real precursor to an actual ground invasion of Rafah?
Well, you have to kind of look at Israel's fundamental mission here, which is ultimately to go after Hamas's leadership that was involved in October 7th. And Israel obviously is not going to allow 4 battalions of Hamas to continue to exist in Rafah. So one way or another, there's going to be a Rafah operation. The issue is whether it's a full-scale bombing and invasion or whether it's a more targeted attack. Hamas, on the other hand, obviously is nervous about that. They're aware that Israel ultimately has to go after them in Rafah. And so they're willing to agree to a ceasefire, but obviously they want a permanent end to the war, which would spell defeat for Israel. So the real question here is, can the parties at least agree to a temporary ceasefire, a temporary pause here that allows for the exchange of hostages and allows for humanitarian aid to be able to go into Gaza? That's really the fundamental question, because ultimately, I think both parties, frankly, are facing a kind of tough decision as to whether or not Israel is going to continue with the mission of the war and whether Hamas is ultimately going to be defeated or not.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I wonder what your answer is to that fundamental question. How likely do you think it is that an agreement can be reached when one side wants this to be temporary, as you say, the other side wants it to be permanent? And this is an effort that has been underway for months without actually yielding a deal.
Well, there's an awful lot of pressure going on between the various Arab countries that are involved, Egypt, Qatar, and others, and the United States, putting a lot of pressure on to try to see if we can arrive at some kind of agreement. Hamas has to recognize that Israel will move on Rafah one way or the other. And so it's probably in their interest to at least have a temporary ceasefire as well. So I think there's a good chance here that ultimately the parties may agree to at least a temporary ceasefire, allows them to take a breath, and allows for exchange of hostages, which is important to Israel. It's important to the world that we get some of these hostages released, and so that we provide humanitarian aid to those that have been impacted by the war. So I think there are some very strong reasons why the parties should agree to at least a temporary ceasefire at this point.
Well, sir, on the subject of hostages, we did hear President Biden raise that issue in particular when he spoke, giving an address on anti-Semitism on Capitol Hill earlier today. Just take a listen, if you would, to what the president said.
My administration is working around the clock to free remaining hostages, just as we have freed hostages already, and will not rest until we bring them all home.
And, sir, of course, you were not just Secretary of Defense or Director of the CIA. You also did serve as White House Chief of Staff. And I wonder, when you heard the words of the president today, not just on the hostages, but about the question of anti-Semitism overall, if you feel that he is doing enough in this moment to address the litany of criticism he is facing for his policy around Israel, his perhaps handling of what's happening on college campuses, whether or not you think he really plays a role there, what should the president be doing differently?
Well, you know, I'm a believer as a former chief of staff that the president has to make clear to the American people exactly what's going on. And the president did speak to the demonstrations. I think the president probably needs to speak more clearly to the American people about what the future path of this war is. Because if it's just the issue of the United States putting pressure on Israel not to do certain things, frankly, I think that creates a lot of confusion as to just exactly where the United States stands on the issue. I think that the United States understands that Israel has the right to defend itself, that it has the right to go after Hamas's leadership, that it has the right to try to make sure that what happened on October 7th never happens again. At the same time, it is important to recognize that we have to get the hostages back and we have to provide humanitarian aid. I don't think those goals are necessarily in conflict, but I think the president has to make clear to the American people why it is that at this point in time, it is important to obviously support Israel in its effort to try to defend itself, but at the same time, make clear that this is a moment when we need to get the exchange of hostages and we need to provide humanitarian aid as well. I think that is the kind of message that should be emanating from the White House.
On the idea of messaging that the U.S. is still standing behind Israel and supporting its defense, we have learned in recent days, sir, that the Biden administration paused an ammunition shipment to Israel. Is that a signal that perhaps the policy in terms of actual military aid being provided might be changing, that some of this could become contingent upon the conduct of the Israeli government and the Israeli army in Gaza? Is that appropriate?
Well, I don't think that there is an underlying message here that, if Israel suddenly proceeds into Rafah in a way that results in a tremendous number of civilian deaths, that there will be a repercussion with regards to military assistance and the conditions on military assistance. On the other hand, if Israel proceeds in a targeted way to go after Hamas and does protect those millions of civilians that are in Rafah, and there are ways to do that, then I think that the United States can continue to be supportive of what Israel is trying to achieve in defending itself. So there's a way to get this done. But I think it takes a tremendous amount of understanding and diplomacy and communication to make sure that everybody is on the same page.